Hello, welcome back to Emerge, the health podcast for busy, high performing women. I'm your host, Dr. Alex Swenson Ridley. I'm very honored and excited for our conversation today with my guest, Dr. Valerie Rein. And she is someone I actually heard her on another mentor of mine's podcast with Eleanor Beaton. And as soon as I heard kind of her journey and story and what she had to share, I was like, oh, we need to have this conversation. She's also got an amazing book out called Patriarchy Stress Disorder, which we will talk about. But Dr. Valerie is a psychologist and women's mental health expert who has discovered patriarchy stress disorder, otherwise known as PSD, and created the only science-backed system for helping women achieve their ultimate success, happiness, and fulfillment by healing the intergenerational trauma of oppression. She holds degrees in psychological counseling from Columbia University and a PhD in psychology from the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. And her #1 Amazon bestselling book, Patriarchy Stress Disorder, The Invisible Barrier to Women's Happiness and Fulfillment, has been heralded by reviewers as the most important body of literary work of our modern times, and perhaps the most important book of the century for women. And our cutting edge programs have helped thousands of women shift from how much can I bear to how good can it get, from surviving to thriving to their work in both their work and their personal lives. So Dr. Valerie, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Alex.
Yeah, I'm very excited for this conversation. And I will say, after I heard your interview, I've read about 75% of your book. I was like really hoping to get it done before we talked, but I got most of the way there. And I will say it's what you have to share is quite profound, and I think has a huge impact for women everywhere dealing with life in general. So before we launch in, I like to just kind of hear a little bit of your own version of your story and kind of what brought you to this point in your life and your career. Um,
Yeah, I think my journey wasn't much different from a journey of any girl living under patriarchy. I kept getting messages growing up that were spelling out for me that something was wrong with me. Something was wrong with me, and I just could never get it right. I I was getting messages, don't be too smart. No one would want to marry you. Don't laugh so loud. People don't like that. Um, the messages were along the lines of I gotta walk a very straight and narrow line to try to be okay. And I kept failing. And I went on to study psychology to figure out what's wrong with me once and for all and fix it. And 2 graduate degrees later, I was living the life that I've always wanted and I worked so hard for. I had a thriving private practice in New York. I had a beautiful family, a lovely home in New York City suburbs. And if you had asked me, Valerie, are you happy? I would have said, absolutely. Absolutely, I'm happy. I have everything I ever wanted. And one day I was on the phone with a client when I noticed I was smiling only with the right side of my face, and the left side of my face just hung there, as did my left arm. And I ended up in the emergency room where I drove myself using my right arm. I ended up in the emergency room with symptoms of a stroke, which thankfully, after hours of scanning me up and down, they ruled out and they gave me the diagnosis of just stress, which was very a huge relief and also a huge surprise because I did not feel stressed. I felt normal. I felt exactly the same way I felt probably my entire life. And so as I was lying there on the hospital gurney in that pretty uncomfortable hospital gown, I've had the time to think and feel for the first time in a long time as a mom, as a professional. And what I was feeling was very, very uncomfortable, even more uncomfortable than a hospital gown, because that question, what's wrong with me, was still alive and well. It It had been buried by work, it had been buried by busyness. However, it showed up at the first opportunity. And here I was trying to figure out, well, first of all, what was creating this amount of stress in my system, unbeknownst to me? And and second, was something so broken? Was I so something was so wrong with me that despite years of self-help, personal development, years in therapy, being a therapist myself, I just couldn't figure this out. I just couldn't right whatever wrong that was with me. And this moment really catalyzed this Rottweiler like commitment to cracking this open. And the answers started coming my way through the discoveries in the field of epigenetics that were showing that trauma is genetically transmitted. Trauma is genetically transmitted. And that was quite a revelation. That's not something the field of psychology was talking about after many years in therapy, trying to figure out what's wrong with me. That never came up. Oh, maybe you inherited some of that stuff, let alone the trauma of oppression. That was not on the radar at all in the conventional psychological conversations. And yet here we were as women having been oppressed for thousands of years, having been carrying the trauma of oppression through patriarchy, and for women of color, and particularly for Black women, this intersectional trauma doubling as the trauma of racism and slavery. And and yet that was not being acknowledged, that was not being talked about. And all the fields of personal development and psychology and coaching were all dead set on helping women figure out what's wrong with them and fix it. And I realized that I was not playing that game anymore. There was nothing wrong with me. There was nothing wrong with anyone else. There was nothing to fix, but there was something to heal. And so that's how this became my mission and my work in the world, helping women uncover this intergenerational trauma of oppression, which I termed patriarchy stress disorder or PSD, and once and for all, bust the myth that there is something wrong with them and they need fixing. Thankfully,
Yeah.
from the field of epigenetics, we know that not only trauma is genetically transmitted, but so is healing. And so every time we uncover this trauma in ourselves, we heal ourselves. This is what we're passing down to our children and everyone around us. So this is
Yeah.
much bigger than us. And this has become a very exciting adventure for what it has had to reveal to me and our clients.
Absolutely. There's lots that we can unpack there.
Mhm.
Starting with, I think the place to start, and we can get into epigenetics a little bit as well, but let's, define trauma, because, and you talk about this in your book, and I know for a lot of women who have had trauma experience, like capital T trauma, and we can talk about that. Um, like that's, for example, myself, I've been through some of that, and it took me a while to admit that it was trauma, because we tend to look at trauma as like, oh well,
Mhm.
it's kind of like sin, right? Like, oh well, it's not as bad as somebody else's, so it must not be real.
Right?
So
Wasn't that
not to
bad?
use right, yeah. So how do you define trauma for our listeners, to just to start to understand? And there's the stuff that happens to us, and then also the stuff that we're carrying from our past. So let's maybe just define that as a starting point.
Yeah, I've come to define trauma as any event or experience that made it feel unsafe for you
Mhm.
to be in your fullest authentic expression, to be who you are, either psychologically unsafe or physically unsafe or both. And it doesn't matter how big or small the experience was, if it created the imprint of, oh, it's not safe, and the imprint is in the subconscious, and it resulted in creating trauma adaptations around it. That is, all these mechanisms that exist in our minds, in our bodies, in our subconscious minds, that are designed to keep us safe from experiencing this ever again. Then that creates that trauma picture. You have to have trauma adaptations. You have to have a moment when, or sometimes it's more than a moment. Sometimes it's a prolonged feeling of not feeling safe, and the resulting trauma adaptations. So that's what creates the whole trauma cluster and experience. It's not the severity of the experience. Two people can go through an experience of the same severity, and one will emerge traumatized, and the other one will not have that traumatic imprint. So let's not judge ourselves and enter ourselves
Yeah.
into imaginary competitions of like, was it bad enough to
Yeah.
qualify as trauma? But let's be very attentive to what we know from our bodies, because our bodies will tell us exactly if there is trauma there.
Yeah. I know my own journey kind of beginning earlier this year, and then I heard your story and found your book, and I was like, oh, this is marrying so much stuff together. But
Mm,
especially, and I know you work with high achieving women as well, and that's a lot of who listens to the show. Like, we're so in our heads that most of us aren't connected at all to our bodies. And so
yeah,
we
yeah.
we have no, kind of like, you sharing, not really feeling stressed. Like, that's just such our normal
Hmm.
operative state that we have no idea that we're actually
Hmm.
struggling with some of this stuff.
Yeah, which in and of itself is a symptom of trauma. If we're not in
Hmm.
our bodies, we're not in our bodies because it's not safe for us to be in our bodies. And chances
Yeah.
are we haven't been in our bodies for a very long time. A lot of it is inherited. Some of it might have been due to the personal experiences that we've had. And there's definitely a big cultural disembodiment. We're living in a very disembodied culture. So, and not only are we not taught an embodied living experience, we don't necessarily have role models around that. And when we do go through traumatic experiences, it makes it so much more difficult to find our way back to heal. Um, because again, there's just no culture of embodiment in the overculture, right, that we're living in.
Right.
There may be, subcultures that people belong to where it's practiced more, but certainly not the overculture. So finding our way back to our bodies is both. Um, it is a trauma healing journey in and of itself, and it is a journey of learning how to live a life, basically, in a way that is preventing new traumas from forming, because when we're in touch with our own direct experience, we can move it through the body, we can process it using embodied tools, and it just enriches our experience of life, right, when we're
Yeah.
living in our bodies, not in our heads. And frankly, I had no idea that I was not living in my body. I had not a clue. I remember I was in my PhD program, and it was an integrative program in that there was some emphasis on embodiment and spirituality and um, different things that were not conventional. And one of my professors pointed out to me, I was sharing something, and he was like, he actually took my arms into his hands and started like knocking my forearms against my head and saying, "How do you embody all this brilliance?" I was like, I don't know how, but definitely is not it. It's not it. And it's not working. And I had no idea what he even meant. I think I had maybe an inkling, but I have never had an experience. And I was in my 30s at the time. I've never had an experience that I would describe as being in my body, which is
Yeah.
kind of frightening, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, there's times that we would maybe hope that we would be in our body, like, and being intimate with a partner or something like that. But I think you talk about in your book, some of the ways to connect, like, especially if we're, say, struggling to, I wasn't planning to go here, but we're just going here, struggling to
Mhm,
orgasm or, you know,
mhm.
some of the stuff that we deal with, especially as we age, a lot of that has more to do with not being present in our bodies versus,
Yeah. Yeah, and
yeah.
it's so mind-boggling because, I've always loved sex and I've always had orgasms. And maybe those were like flashes of grace of like being in my body for just like a moment, just
Yeah.
like enough time to like register an orgasmic experience. But also there are degrees, I think, right? It's not like black and white. Here I am completely not in my body, and here I am completely in my body. Um,
Mhm.
so I think the needle definitely moved, but um after getting on the path of discovering trauma and how it lives in the body and working with the tools to heal it, that revolutionized my relationship with my body completely, and with sex that went absolutely to a whole new level, and just the experience of living anything from just moving through my day to cuddling with my daughter to just feeling all the feelings, whatever they are. um yeah, that's just night and day. I don't even know how I existed before. Well, in my head, that I can now relate a lot of the things that were just not satisfying in my life to existing in my head. But that's not something I ever heard from my therapists, right? They were also
Right.
existing in their heads, and they would have been very surprised to know that there was something outside.
Yeah. Well, and I think that brings up an interesting point and something I've been kind of exploring with people as well. And maybe it's just the conversations that I've been engaged in or attracting recently, but there might be some move in therapy away from just being talk oriented and
Yeah.
moving more into,
Mhm.
you know, connecting to the body and movement and some of the
Mhm.
things that you talk about in the book. I hope there is because, you know,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's definitely there are practitioners who have been on journeys that might have been similar to my own, who've
hmm
always been looking for different ways to serve their clients and get themselves out of this predicament. Um, yeah, I don't know how prevalent this is in terms of conventional education and training of therapists, how deeply embodiment practices and trauma awareness have infiltrated into the conventional matrix.
yeah.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
usually not the first to change. It is a very patriarchal field, just like, well, most fields are, to be
Yeah.
fair.
Like
But
medicine in
individual
general. Yeah.
practitioners, yeah, who have been on their own journeys and have been making their own discoveries are definitely leading change.
Yeah, which is incredible and good and all the things. So let's talk about first I want to go back to epigenetics because I've talked about it some on the show. And when I was first introduced to Bruce Lipton's work, who I think he was one of the first to kind
Mhm.
of talk about
Yes.
that our environment influences the expression of our genes of our cells. It's not so much that we're just born with a gene, it's whether or not it gets turned on and off. And
Mhm.
we have control over that. But at the time I was still in school, so that was back in the late like 2010-ish time. But
Mm.
when we're looking at, transgenerational trauma, because this is a concept that I'm like so excited to see the research on and just
Mm.
coming out, because I found, as and I you share in your book, like you don't necessarily have some of those trauma that's happened to you personally, but there's like stuff that has come up for you, right? And I think a lot of women that I work with either have, most of us have some combination of the two, because I think all of
Mhm.
us living in a patriarchal world can relate to not feeling like, feeling unsafe being ourselves at some point.
Yeah,
Um,
and
yeah.
frankly, there are a lot of experiences that I just minimized, right?
Hmm.
Because again, the conventional psychological model did not acknowledge anything outside of a life-threatening experience as traumatic.
Right.
Yeah, these are all recent developments when we started looking at adverse childhood experiences as traumatic. We started recognizing a wider spectrum of trauma, but at the time, I just didn't know. I didn't know. I thought, okay, it's just normal, right? I mean, everybody gets, yelled at and scared and has experiences of abandonment and like it's life, right? So
Right.
didn't occur to me to count them as traumatic and unwanted sexual experiences. Well, I wasn't held at a gunpoint, so maybe it wasn't that bad, right?
Right.
Um, I am convinced. I hope things are changing um, with the younger generations. I really hope that things are changing with all of the awareness that we have now. Um, but women of my generation, I don't know anyone who has not had an unwanted sexual experience. It's just kind of came with the territory. It's again, it's kind of frightening. But if we stop minimizing, if we stop like, if we kind of step out of this imaginary competition, like does that actually qualify as trauma, and we trust our embodied experiences, then we'll discover, oh shit, right? That did not feel good, right? That did not feel
Yeah.
right. I did not feel safe. Yes, it did create trauma adaptations, and that did impact me and perhaps is impacting me now. So there's a lot of discovery there, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I've been discovering even after the book came out, and we've worked with so many women since the book was published, and their courage and their discoveries have helped me make more discoveries about my own journey. And because um, we do get on this healing journey, trauma healing journey in a community, which I'm now convinced is the way to go when we're working with collective trauma, intergenerational trauma. Um, uh, every time a woman discovers another layer of her experience that she maybe has not considered traumatic, there is such a ripple effect throughout the community because she helps others recognize, oh my gosh, me too, me too, me too. And that alone is deeply healing. It's the opposite of living in a perpetually gaslighting society, perpetually being invalidating and gaslighting ourselves, to going, oh my gosh, what if that actually did impact me? What if this was traumatic? And being really seen and heard and validated and made safe on this healing journey. So I think that there are more layers of trauma for us all to discover
Yeah.
as we're made safe, right? As we feel safe on this journey, because that is the number one condition for healing.
Yeah. And I love that you bring that up. And it's, I found, like, since reading your book and some of the other work I've been doing on my own, just as a practitioner in on my own journey, because I think all of us are on our own journey, right?
Mhm.
Um, Finding that place that feels safe, like especially if
Yeah.
you haven't really been in your body, is challenging. Like there's areas now I've been kind of playing around with, I'm certified in, I just got certified in heart math. So like some heart focused breathing plus touch, plus like just
Mhm.
focusing my attention in different areas of my body. And like some of them
Mhm.
really don't feel good. Like I get
Yes.
nauseous or I get like, I almost can't handle it yet. And so it's like, okay, I keep
Mhm.
pulling out the layers. And it's not necessarily that we need to know why that is or where that came from. I don't think like
Yeah.
as we keep uncovering it, it's good, but just releasing that stuff from the body is
Yeah. Yeah,
huge.
yeah, it is huge. And the body doesn't lie, the body doesn't forget, the body that doesn't make up
Hmm.
stories. And so going directly to our experiences, not even trying to analyze them, not certainly not judging them, but being
Yeah,
very, very honest with ourselves and gentle with ourselves on this healing journey. This is where community support is invaluable, where it allows us to plug into this bigger nervous system as we co-regulate as a community. It's like going from a little laptop computer to plugging into this huge mainframe that can process so much more information so much faster. So yeah, because I've had the experiences of working one-on-one with a practitioner doing trauma work. I've used some tools by myself. I've worked in different environments, but it wasn't until I came to experience the power of the community on this journey that I became convinced that this is the way to go. And sometimes this is very frightening
yeah,
because right, it's our trauma defenses don't want us to get on the trauma healing journey. They are protecting those places. It doesn't feel safe to go there. And we hear a lot from women that hesitation, and many of us have had traumatic experiences with that took place in communities, be it a community of just one other person or a larger community.
yeah,
And healing also lies there. So just, and again, it is so countercultural because we are living in such an individualistic culture. There is this myth that's being perpetrated that, you got to figure it out yourself. It's all you, it's all you. And that's how you get to be a strong woman. And the truth is we are much stronger in community.
yeah,
And there is no, there is no, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of, it's not a badge of honor to try to figure it out by ourselves. But patriarchy
yeah,
makes it so. Patriarchy
yeah,
absolutely makes it a badge of honor. That hurts us. Hurts us in the long run.
yeah. Well, it's like it's made so many things. I don't know that taboo is the right word, but
Yeah.
we've been so trained, and I think this is an intergenerational thing, just with
Yeah.
women not really having a voice and not,
Hmm.
being viewed as important or any of that. So it's hard. I know I've had a hard time and seen in the women that I work with, this like being willing to even talk about it or feeling
Yeah.
like, they have to figure it out on their own and they have to have a certain level of it figured out before they can come and, talk to anybody else
Oh,
about it.
yeah. Right? Isn't that
So,
something though? So, yeah, I'm so happy that you and I are having this conversation. It's like these conversations that begin to pierce the bubble
mhm,
of the silos of shame and something's wrong with me and I gotta figure it out myself before I talk to anybody else. It's just so damaging. And we didn't come up with any of that. It's not even our own thoughts. It's the patriarchal conditioning that is creating that. So I hope perhaps somebody listening right now, maybe the dots begin to connect for you.
yeah,
Where your true empowerment lies, it is not in trying to muscle your way through. It's kind of the opposite. It's acknowledging, I am not okay. I'm not okay. There's so much
yeah,
courage in acknowledging that I'm not okay. I'm not feeling great. And even if you think you're feeling great, Oh, you have no idea how much better it can get.
It's
this,
very
this,
true.
this has become the battle cry of the work. How good can it get? I
Yeah,
just picked up journals that we made for an upcoming retreat, and they say, "How good can it get on the spine?" And
love it.
it just makes me smile. Like every time I remember that none of what I have in my life right now, not my life experience, not what is in my life, how my life is, none of that was believable. Like I wouldn't have believed that any of that would be possible. My biggest ambition, which I also didn't believe that was possible, but my biggest desire, I guess, was just to wake up and feel okay, just to feel okay. That was my admittedly very modest, but something that felt huge because I didn't
Right.
think it was possible for me. And according to conventional therapy, it really was not. I had repeated bouts of depression. I had incapacitating anxiety. So according to the conventional model, this is something I would live with for the rest of my life. And medication was the only way for me to manage the symptoms, but I would never be symptom free.
Yeah,
And I've been symptom free for many years now. And I just want to shout off the from the rooftops that it's possible. Like what's possible for us is so much greater than we even dare imagine.
yeah,
um, yeah.
yeah. That's, one of the things that really has pulled me through my life. I share this quote all the time, the Marianne
Mhm.
Williamson quote, our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate, our deepest fear is that we are
Mhm.
powerful beyond measure. And most of us can't grasp that concept because we're so, hell bent on playing small and having to do it all on our own and
Yeah, and again,
really
that's
limiting
all
ourselves.
conditioning. That is
Yeah,
all the it's the package of trauma that has been passed down to us, that the trauma adaptations of playing small are very much there, and it has never been safe for women not
yeah,
to play small. So
yeah,
we come by it honestly. It's not an individual thing. It's not like, oh my gosh, like you're really fucking up. You're playing small. Like it's bigger than any one of us.
yeah,
And I think it would be a disservice to focus on the individual here because it is truly a collective condition and something that we must all participate in healing. As
yeah,
every time um any one of us reclaims more of her authentic expression, more of her authentic bigness, more of what she's here to be, do, have, experience. Yeah, I mean, the bricks fall out of the patriarchal walls everywhere for everyone.
yeah. And I'm really, I believe more of us need to hear this message. I'm curious about your input on this because I've found, and when I've expanded a lot in my life,
Mhm.
inevitably who I come up against and get like the most pushback or cattiness, or I've had some like very interesting experiences of other women kind of, I'm losing the word, but putting all
Mhm.
their own insecurities on me, essentially, like,
Mhm.
and I would make the argument that a lot of who perpetuates this patriarchal society is
Yeah.
actually women who are like so
Mhm.
freaked out by something else. And so, we
Yeah.
tend to be really weirdly competitive and
Yeah. Yeah.
critical of each other.
Absolutely.
So I'm
Yeah.
curious about
If
your input
women,
on that.
absolutely, if women didn't perpetuate patriarchy, it would not stand, right?
Right.
And it stands through women's buy-in. And it's a painful topic. It's a very painful
Mhm.
topic because all of us have experienced that. All of us have experienced that unhealthy, toxic competitiveness
Yeah.
from other women, and perhaps we've been on the perpetrating side as well. Maybe not in the ways that we can even immediately think about, but there are so many subtle ways in which we have been trained to uphold patriarchy in policing each other's bodies, each other's appearance, even if we don't say anything, but we judge internally, right? We compare ourselves. Again, this imaginary competition. Where am I ranking compared to her? Like, right? Is she winning? Am I winning? Are we kind of on par? It's so deeply encoded in our survival matrix because to survive, patriarchy gave us the rules of survival, and survival has been attached to men,
Yeah.
um, and white men specifically. So white women are really, really programmed very deeply to compete for white men. Even if we don't believe that crap, even if we're like not buying into this, absolutely. But this is the root of this competition, right? And judging ourselves and judging others. And it's frightening, like when we begin to discover what's living in our subconscious, even if we don't believe that at all. And yeah, it goes to show how sisterhood has been just destroyed, demolished by
Yeah.
patriarchy, and a huge part of healing is reclaiming that sisterhood, reclaiming relating to ourselves and other women as sovereign beings, not
Yeah.
not liable to show up in a certain way, looking a certain way, sounding a certain way, acting a certain way. And we can only liberate other women of our own tyranny
Yeah.
by liberating ourselves. And it's big. The work is big.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Um, and it's definitely not, none of this is individual. Like it will take communities and more communities to do the work to undo
Yeah.
the things for
Hmm.
the future generations. Um,
Yeah. And thankfully,
yeah.
all of it is absolutely movable. All of this is, I
Mhm.
mean, just seeing what our thrivers experience, witnessing what they experience together, and how the changes that they experience being on this trauma healing journey, how they have a ripple effect into their families, into their work in the world, into their communities is just astonishing. I mean,
Yeah.
just a couple of stories that rocked my world lately. There was a woman who joined our program. She's still in our program right now. Who She called it corporate trauma. She joined because she said, "I want to feel something. I want to feel anything other than tired." So I haven't
Yeah.
felt anything other than tired for years. And she was a very high ranking professional in the IT world, very male dominated. And so she did really well in her career, and she had a wonderful family, and everything was wonderful from the outside looking in. But she couldn't feel anything, right? Other than tired.
Right.
It was killing her. And and eventually as she was on her healing journey, she recognized all the toxic patterns at work that she was ready to step out of. She stepped into her passion in the world. She's revolutionizing the field of IT, pulling patriarchy and racism out of how technology works and operates. So her mission is really big, and she
Yeah.
is now on flying her mission, piloting her mission fully. She stepped out of the corporate environment, and she already has phenomenal partnerships with some leading organizations, institutions who are like, yes, please bring this to us. And
Amazing.
all of that became possible, right? As she reclaimed who she is, as she reclaimed herself and being in her body. Like,
Yeah.
thankfully, that guidance of her body was very insistent It would have been easy to say, oh, my life is good. Why am I complaining? But she wouldn't give up on her life. She wouldn't give up on feeling all her feelings. That was not okay with her, not to feel anything other than tired. And that's where the revolution begins, right? By
Yeah.
not settling. We cannot settle. We cannot drown in freaking social media and media otherwise, right?
Yeah.
We can't be complicit in forgetting who we are.
Absolutely. And I love in the book, I think the part I just read last night was around, what are we tolerating in our lives? I think that's
Yes.
it's a good thing to like. First, you have to connect. And you also bring up a point, like a lot of the work I do with women has centered around being healthy, hormones, kind of the perimenopause
Yeah.
era. But what I'm recognizing more and more, and same with it's leadership, it's business, like anywhere where you're not fully expressed and showing up like happy and in
Mhm.
yourself, it's about going within. It's not about you know eat this way or do this, read this
Yeah.
book for leadership or like whatever it is. Like
Right.
we have to go inside.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is somewhere our culture really, really, really doesn't want us to go
Nope.
anywhere else.
Yeah.
Anywhere else. Because when people go inside and they're in touch with their own inner knowing, they're in touch with their bodies don't lie. People become unmanipulatable, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
People become sovereign beings. And patriarchy wouldn't stand, racism wouldn't stand,
Mhm.
none of the systems of oppression would stand when people actually feel their own feelings. And the foods
Yeah.
that we've fed, right? We go into the
Hmm.
supermarket and we're like, okay, it's in the supermarket. That must be food, but
Right.
it's not.
But it's not.
Like all of that dulls our ability to feel, like a lot of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely swimming upstream like
Hmm.
salmon, and
Hmm.
it's a big upstream swim, but it's so worth it. It's so worth it.
Absolutely. So in bringing this full circle, and we'll kind of wrap up because I know we've given everybody lots to think about, but what
Mhm.
what recommendations? I know you talk about a few things in your book, but for women listening that are like, how, my initial reaction, I had a coach earlier this year say, "Where do you feel that in your body?" And I was like, "What?"
Right.
I have no idea. So
Mhm.
what recommendations do you have for just starting some of that embodiment journey? Like obviously having community and getting support around it is key as well, but for those who want to start to explore,
Yeah.
where do we
So
start?
so starting with the book is a great place to start. It comes with
Hmm.
some practices that you can explore and start mapping out the terrain. So if you go to drvalerie.com/book, you can download every chapter there, both on audio and PDF. And you can get your hands on the book resources there too.
Yeah.
And you can purchase the book there too that I've narrated for you. So I baked in a lot of energy. I consume a lot of audiobooks, so I figured that
Hmm.
may serve somebody else.
Yeah.
And we try to make this journey very, very accessible at the entry point. Yes, you can get your hands on the book and the tools, and you can come in and experience this work in community with us. Um, 2 or 3 times a year, we hold a big 3-day experience where the tickets start at free of charge. We try to make it really, really, really accessible for folks. Obviously, you still need to commit to showing up, and that sometimes is
Right.
the hardest thing for
Yeah.
women. And that is actually very diagnostic too. Like, yeah, like I want to make changes in my life, but I really can't carve out this time. And then my question becomes like, if you don't have the time, who has your time? Because
Yeah.
Somebody
Somebody has
does.
it, or
I
something has
promise you,
it. Yeah.
somebody has your time. So if that comes up for anyone, just start with this compassionate investigation of who has your time, because you will need time for healing. You will need to reclaim your
Yeah.
time. And so the experience is called the Thriving Experience. The thrivingexperience.com is where you can learn more and register to join us. This is where you can experience both the work and the community aspect, which the book cannot replicate. So make sure that you give yourself that experience. And this is where I would start. We have programs as well that we open doors to on a regular basis. You can learn more on our website, drvalerie.com.
Yeah.
But really starting where you are, starting with that honest, deep, big desire that even if you don't know exactly where you're going and how good it can get, it's okay. Just give yourself permission to, I guess, revolt, to not sign up for normal anymore, to not sign up for it's okay, I'm okay, it's not that bad anymore. Give yourself that permission to want more, because I promise you, there is so much more that you get to be, do, have, experience, and it can get so much better. How good can it get? So I hope that um you borrow our battle cry and that
Yeah.
it becomes your companion on this journey.
Absolutely. Gives me chills to think about. So, um,
Right? Because your body
yeah,
knows something that
yeah. It's like, all right,
she's
how good can
always
it get?
speaking
Like,
to us. Yes.
yeah, let's go, let's do it. Well, Dr. Valerie, thank you so much for coming on and
My
just
pleasure. Thank
sharing
you for
sharing
having
your
me.
wisdom around this. Yeah, absolutely. And for our listeners, I will put links to all of that in our show notes, and we will see you on our next episode.